Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Call. Craig Stevens had always prided himself on reading people. 20 years as a criminal investigator with the State Bureau of Investigation had honed his instincts to a razor's edge. Even now, 5 years into his private security consulting business, he could spot deception from across a crowded room. But nothing had prepared him for the terror in his 8-year-old daughter's voice that Tuesday evening. He was reviewing case files in his home office when his cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Emma's number, the emergency phone they'd given her for situations exactly like sleepovers at Aunt Cassie's house. "Hey, sweetheart," Craig answered warmly. "Having fun with Aunt Cassie and Uncle Dan. Daddy, help. Come get me now." Emma's voice was strangled with panic, barely above a whisper. Craig's blood turned to ice. His daughter had never sounded like this, not even during her worst nightmares. "Emma, what's wrong? Calm down and tell Daddy what's happening. Auntie and Uncle are doing things to me that I can't say." The words came out in a terrified rush. "Please, Daddy, I'm scared." The line went dead. Craig stared at the phone for exactly 2 seconds before his training kicked in. He was already moving toward the stairs, shouting for his wife. "Christina, we need to go. Now." Christina Stevens appeared at the top of the stairs, her auburn hair still damp from the shower. One look at her husband's face told her everything she needed to know. In their 15 years of marriage, she'd seen Craig handle armed suspects, death threats, and corrupt politicians with unwavering composure. She'd never seen him look like this. "Emma," she whispered. "Get in the car," Craig said, his voice deadly calm. "I'll explain on the way." As Christina threw on clothes, Craig's mind raced through possibilities. Dan Woodard had married Christina's younger sister, Cassie, 3 years ago. Craig had never liked the man. There was something off about his too-perfect smile and the way his eyes never quite met yours when he spoke. But Cassie was head over heels, and Christina had begged Craig to give her new brother-in-law a chance. Craig grabbed his service weapon from the gun safe, checked the magazine, and secured it in his shoulder holster. Old habits died hard, and right now, he was grateful for every single one of them. The drive to Cassie's house normally took 40 minutes. Craig made it in 25, running red lights, and pushing his BMW to its limits while Christina called Emma's number repeatedly. Each ring that went unanswered felt like a knife twisting in his chest. "Tell me exactly what she said," Christina demanded, her voice shaking. Craig recounted the conversation word for word, his investigator's memory serving him perfectly. Christina's face grew paler with each detail. "Dan's been so good with Emma," she whispered. "He always volunteers to babysit, takes her to the park." "Oh God, Craig, what if—" "Don't," Craig cut her off. "We don't know anything yet, but we're going to find out." They pulled into the driveway of the modest 2-story house at 9:47 p.m. Every light was on, which struck Craig as odd. He'd expected them to be asleep by now, or at least settling down for the night. Craig approached the front door with Christina close behind. Before he could knock, Cassie opened it, her face flushed and her smile too bright. "Craig, Christina, what a surprise. What brings you by so late?" "We're here for Emma," Craig said, his eyes scanning past Cassie into the house. "She called us." "Oh, she must have been having a nightmare," Cassie said quickly. "You know how kids are with sleepovers." "She's fine now, though. Already back asleep." Everything about Cassie's demeanor screamed deception. Her hands were shaking, her pupils dilated, and she kept glancing over her shoulder as if waiting for someone to appear. "I'd like to see her," Craig said. It wasn't a request. "Well, she's sleeping, and you know how cranky she gets when she's woken up." "Cassie," Christina stepped forward. "Where's my daughter?" Before Cassie could answer, Dan appeared behind her. Craig's trained eye immediately cataloged the man's appearance. Disheveled clothing, flushed face, and a thin sheen of sweat despite the cool evening air. "Hey there, folks," Dan said with his trademark grin. "Emma's having such a good time. Hate to cut the sleepover short. She called us," Craig said, his voice level. "She was scared. Kids and their imaginations, right?" Dan chuckled, but Craig caught the slight tremor in his voice. "She probably had a bad dream and got confused. You know how it is. Craig stepped closer, using his 6'2" frame to full advantage. Dan was shorter, softer, the kind of man who'd never been in a real fight. "I'd like to speak with my daughter." Now, the tension in the air was palpable. Christina moved to support her husband, while Cassie seemed to shrink into herself. "Of course," Dan said finally. "She's upstairs. I'll get her." "We'll come with you," Craig said. As they climbed the stairs, Craig's mind was working overtime. Dan's body language, Cassie's nervous energy, the way they both kept glancing at each other. Everything pointed to a situation spiraling out of control, and Emma was at the center of it. They found Emma in the guest room, sitting on the bed in her pajamas. The moment she saw her parents, she launched herself into Craig's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "Daddy, I want to go home. Please take me home." Craig held his daughter close, feeling her small body trembling against his chest. Over her head, he met Dan's eyes and saw something that made his blood run cold. Not embarrassment or confusion, but calculation. Dan was already working out his next move. "Thank you for having her," Christina said coldly, gathering Emma's things. "We'll be going now." As they prepared to leave, Craig lingered in the doorway, studying Dan's face. 20 years of interrogation experience had taught him to read micro-expressions, and what he saw confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. "Craig," Dan called as they headed for the car. "I hope there's no misunderstanding here. Emma's always welcome in our home." Craig turned back slowly. "There's no misunderstanding, Dan. None at all." The drive home was tense. Emma fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted from her ordeal, while Christina peppered Craig with whispered questions he couldn't yet answer. Back home, they tucked Emma into her own bed, and Craig waited until he was sure she was asleep before joining Christina in their bedroom. "What do we do now?" Christina asked. Craig was already reaching for his laptop. Now we find out exactly who Dan Woodard really is. Chapter 2, Revelations. Craig spent the next 3 days conducting the most thorough background investigation of his career. What he discovered made his stomach turn and his hands clench into fists. Daniel Marcus Woodard, age 34, had a carefully constructed identity that fell apart under serious scrutiny. His employment history showed gaps that didn't add up, references that led to disconnected phone numbers, and educational credentials that couldn't be verified. More disturbing were the patterns Craig uncovered. Over the past decade, Dan had lived in 4 different states, always leaving abruptly after 18 to 24 months. In each location, there had been whispered allegations involving children. Nothing that stuck, nothing officially reported, but consistent enough to form a clear picture. Craig's contacts in law enforcement were invaluable. Detective Warren Young from the Riverside Police Department owed Craig a favor from his bureau days, and he wasn't shy about sharing what he knew. "Your brother-in-law's name has come up in our files twice in the past year," Warren told Craig over coffee at a diner downtown. Both times involving inappropriate contact with minors at the community center where he volunteers. "Why wasn't he arrested?" Craig demanded. Warren's expression darkened. "Because both times, the family suddenly decided not to press charges. Both times, they received anonymous donations to their children's college funds. Both times, they moved out of state within 6 months." The pieces were falling into place, and Craig didn't like the picture they were forming. Dan wasn't just a predator. He was a sophisticated one with resources and connections. "There's something else," Warren continued. "Dan's got friends in high places. Judge Patrick Nelson plays poker with him twice a month. District Attorney Ernest Chung's wife works at the charity where Dan volunteers. This guy's been building a network of protection." Craig's phone buzzed with a text from Christina. "Emma's therapist wants to see us both. Today, 4 p.m. Dr. Agnes Koch was a child psychologist with 30 years of experience. Her office was warm and inviting, but her expression was grim as she met with Craig and Christina. "I've had 2 sessions with Emma," she began. "She's exhibiting classic signs of sexual trauma. Nightmares, regression in behavior, fear of being alone with adult men, and most telling, age-inappropriate knowledge about sexual acts." Christina's face went white. Craig felt his world tilt on its axis. Emma described specific incidents. Dr. Koch continued gently. She's consistent in her details, and her emotional responses are genuine. In my professional opinion, she was sexually abused during her stay at your sister's house. The words hit Craig like physical blows. His 8-year-old daughter, his baby girl, had been violated by a man he'd allowed into their lives. "What's our next step?" Craig asked, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. "Report it to the authorities," Dr. Koch said. "I'm mandated to do so regardless, but having parental support makes the process easier for Emma." That evening, Craig and Christina met with Detective Marty Jones from the Special Victims Unit. Jones was thorough and compassionate, but Craig could see the writing on the wall before they'd even finished giving their statement. "Mr. Stevens," Jones said carefully, "I want you to know we take these allegations very seriously. But I have to be honest with you about the challenges we're facing, such as Emma's age makes her testimony complicated. Defense attorneys will claim she was coached or confused. We have no physical evidence, and the only witnesses are Dan and Cassie, who will obviously deny everything." Craig's jaw tightened. "So what are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that even if we arrest Dan Woodard, and that's a big if, there's a good chance he'll walk. And given his connections in this town, there's an even better chance this case gets buried before it reaches trial." That night, Craig couldn't sleep. He stood in Emma's doorway, watching his daughter toss and turn, calling out for him in her dreams. The system that had been his life's work was failing his family when they needed it most. He made a decision that would change everything. Craig returned to his office and began making phone calls. His network of contacts extended far beyond local law enforcement. He called in favors, shared information, and slowly began assembling a picture of Dan Woodard's true identity and network of protection. Joseph Burton, a federal investigator Craig had worked with years ago, provided the breakthrough. "Your guy isn't working alone," Burton told him during a secure video call. "We've been tracking a network of wealthy individuals involved in child exploitation. They provide financial support and legal protection in exchange for services. Dan Woodard's name appears in encrypted communications we intercepted 6 months ago." Craig felt his blood run cold. "How many others?" "At least a dozen in your state alone. Judges, politicians, business leaders. They've been operating with impunity for years because they protect each other." The conversation continued for another hour, with Burton sharing details that made Craig's stomach churn. Emma wasn't Dan's first victim. She was part of a much larger pattern of abuse and exploitation. When Craig finally hung up, he sat in silence for a long time. The system wouldn't give his family justice. The law couldn't touch these people. But Craig wasn't bound by the same rules anymore. He opened his laptop and began typing. If the authorities wouldn't stop Dan Woodard and his network, Craig would do it himself. And he knew exactly where to start. Chapter 3: The System Fails. 2 weeks later, Craig's worst fears were confirmed. Despite Dr. Koch's testimony and Emma's brave statements to Detective Jones, the district attorney's office declined to press charges against Dan Woodard. Craig sat across from Assistant District Attorney Felipe Gibbons, struggling to maintain his composure as the man delivered what amounted to a death sentence for justice. "The evidence is circumstantial," Gibbons said with practiced indifference. "A child's testimony, no physical evidence, no corroborating witnesses. Any competent defense attorney would tear our case apart." "My daughter was raped," Craig said through gritted teeth. "She's 8 years old. She's in therapy because of what that animal did to her. I understand your frustration, Mr. Stevens, but I have to consider what I can prove in court, not just what I believe happened." Craig leaned forward. "What if I told you Dan Woodard is part of a larger network? That there are other victims, other families who've been silenced?" Gibbons's expression didn't change. "Do you have evidence of this network? Names, documentation, financial records?" Craig had plenty of evidence, thanks to Joseph Burton's investigation. But sharing it would compromise an ongoing federal operation and potentially destroy any chance of bringing down the entire network. "I have credible intelligence." "Intelligence isn't evidence, Mr. Stevens. Bring me something I can use in court and we'll talk." Walking out of the DA's office, Craig felt 20 years of faith in the justice system crumble around him. He dedicated his career to the belief that good ultimately triumphed over evil, that the system, however flawed, would protect the innocent. He'd been naive. That afternoon brought another devastating blow. Christina met him at home with tears in her eyes and legal papers in her hands. "Cassie filed for a restraining order," she said, "against both of us. She's claiming we're harassing her and Dan, that we're making false accusations to break up their marriage." Craig scanned the documents. Judge Patrick Nelson, Dan's poker buddy, had signed the order. It prohibited Craig and Christina from contacting Dan or Cassie, coming within 500 feet of their home, or discussing the allegations with anyone in their social circle. "They're isolating us," Craig realized, "making us look like the unstable ones." The phone rang. It was Dr. Koch. "I wanted to let you know that I received a call from the state licensing board," she said carefully. "Someone filed a complaint about my treatment of Emma, claiming I coerced her testimony. I'm under investigation." Craig closed his eyes. The network was moving fast, using their influence to neutralize anyone who might support Emma's case. "Doctor, I want you to know." "Mr. Stevens," she interrupted gently, "I've been doing this for 30 years. I know what I saw, and I know what Emma told me. No investigation is going to change that. But I wanted you to understand what you're up against." After hanging up, Craig looked at his wife and daughter. Emma was coloring at the kitchen table, but she flinched every time a car drove past their house. Christina's eyes were red from crying, and she'd lost weight from the stress. They were all victims now. Craig made his decision that night. He called Warren Young and arranged a meeting at a secluded location outside town. "I need your help," Craig told his old friend as they sat in Young's patrol car overlooking the river. "Not as a cop, as a friend." Warren studied Craig's face in the dim light. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking the system has failed my family. I'm thinking Dan Woodard and his friends believe they're untouchable. And I'm thinking it's time someone proved them wrong." "Craig, you're talking about vigilante justice. That's not you." "The man who believed in the system isn't me anymore," Craig replied. "He died the day I realized his daughter's rapist would never see the inside of a courtroom." Warren was quiet for a long moment. "What do you need?" Over the next hour, Craig outlined his plan. It was audacious, dangerous, and completely illegal. It would require Warren to risk his career and Craig to abandon everything he'd once stood for. "This could destroy us both," Warren warned. "Dan Woodard destroyed my family," Craig said. "I'm just returning the favor." The next morning, Craig began laying the groundwork for Dan's destruction. He started by visiting Tyrone Clayton, a private investigator who specialized in divorce cases and had a reputation for bending rules when the situation warranted it. "I need everything on Dan Woodard," Craig told him. "His real history, his financial records, his connections, his weaknesses. Everything." Clayton studied the photos and documents Craig provided. "This is going to be expensive and dangerous. Men with this kind of protection don't go down easy." "Money's no object," Craig said. "And as for danger, I'm counting on it." While Clayton began his investigation, Craig reached out to another old contact, Emmanuel Christian, a computer specialist who'd left the Bureau under less than ideal circumstances but retained his skills and his resentment toward authority. "I need digital surveillance," Craig explained during their meeting in a crowded mall food court. "Phone records, email accounts, banking information. Can you do it without leaving traces?" Emmanuel's smile was predatory. "For the right price, I can make it look like Dan Woodard is investigating himself." Craig's final recruitment was the most important. Alfred Moore had been his partner during his last 3 years with the Bureau, before taking early retirement after a corruption scandal that had never quite been resolved. Alfred had always operated in gray areas, and Craig suspected he'd be amenable to a project that existed outside the boundaries of law. They met at Alfred's cabin in the mountains, 30 miles from the nearest neighbor. "You want to destroy a pedophile ring," Alfred said after Craig laid out everything he knew. "Can't say I'm opposed to the concept. It's not just about justice," Craig admitted. "It's about revenge. I want Dan Woodard to suffer the way my daughter has suffered. I wanted to know what it feels like to be helpless and afraid." Alfred poured himself another whiskey and considered. "You know this makes us criminals. The law didn't protect Emma. Maybe criminals can." Alfred raised his glass. to crimes of conscience. By the end of the week, Craig had assembled his team and begun the preliminary phases of his plan. Dan Woodard thought he was untouchable, protected by his network of powerful friends. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Chapter 4. Building the Case. 6 weeks after Emma's assault, Craig's underground investigation had transformed him into someone even he didn't recognize. The methodical, by-the-book investigator had been replaced by a man driven by a single purpose: Dan Woodard's complete destruction. Tyrone Clayton's research had uncovered disturbing patterns spanning 2 decades. Dan's real name was Daniel Marcus Slaughter, and he'd been using variations of his identity to evade detection across multiple states. "Your boy's got a system," Clayton reported during their weekly meeting, an abandoned warehouse Craig had rented for operational security. "He targets families with young children, insinuates himself into their communities, grooms his victims for months before making his move." The files Clayton spread across the makeshift conference table painted a horrifying picture. Police reports that had been buried, families who'd been threatened into silence, and a paper trail of financial payoffs that led back to a network of wealthy individuals. "How many victims?" Craig asked, though he dreaded the answer. "That I can prove? 14 children over the past 8 years. But I suspect there are more. Many more." Emmanuel Christian's digital surveillance had been equally productive. From his mobile command center, a modified van filled with state-of-the-art hacking equipment, he'd penetrated Dan's electronic communications and discovered a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. "He's sloppy with his digital security," Emmanuel explained, showing Craig encrypted chat logs on his laptop screen. "Uses the same password for everything. Clicks on phishing emails. Never updates his software. For a criminal, he's remarkably stupid about technology." The chat logs revealed Dan's connections to his network of protectors. Judge Patrick Nelson provided legal immunity in exchange for access to Dan's victims. District Attorney Ernest Chung buried investigations that got too close to the truth. Business leader Gilberto McGee provided financial resources and safe houses. Most disturbing were the videos. Dan had been documenting his crimes, creating a personal collection that he shared with his network of fellow predators. "Can we use this as evidence?" Craig asked. Emmanuel shook his head. "Not legally. I obtained it through illegal surveillance. But we can use it other ways." Alfred Moore's contribution was more psychological than technical. His years of experience with criminal psychology had helped Craig understand exactly what motivated Dan and his associates. "These people believe they're untouchable because they've never faced real consequences," Alfred explained. "They've insulated themselves from justice through wealth and connections, but that same insulation makes them vulnerable in other ways." Alfred had been developing profiles of each network member, identifying their individual weaknesses and pressure points. "Nelson's got a gambling problem that his wife doesn't know about. Chung's having an affair with his secretary. McGee's been embezzling from his children's charity. They're all keeping secrets that could destroy them if revealed." Craig studied the profiles, his mind working through possibilities. "So we turn them against each other." "Exactly. Right now, they're unified by mutual self-interest. But if we can make each one believe the others are going to betray them." The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than attacking the network head-on, they would create paranoia and suspicion within the group, causing it to collapse from the inside. Craig's phone buzzed with a text from Warren Young. "Meeting tonight. Usual place. Important." They met at the river overlook where they'd first discussed Craig's plan. Warren looked troubled, his usual confidence replaced by nervous energy. "We've got a problem," Warren said without preamble. "Dan knows you're investigating him." Craig's blood ran cold. "Ow! Sources I can't reveal. But he's been asking questions, making phone calls. He knows you've been digging into his past. This changed everything." If Dan was aware of Craig's investigation, it meant the network was preparing countermeasures. "What kind of questions?" "About your background, your contacts, your family's daily routines." "Craig, I think he's planning something." The implication hit Craig like a physical blow. Dan wasn't content to hide behind his network of protection anymore. He was going on the offensive. Craig drove home that night with his mind racing. As he pulled into his driveway, he noticed a strange car parked across the street. It could be nothing, a neighbor's visitor, someone lost, and checking their phone. But Craig's instincts were screaming danger. He entered the house to find Christina and Emma in the living room, watching a movie. Everything seemed normal, but Craig couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "How was your day?" Christina asked. "Fine," Craig lied. "How's Emma doing?" Their daughter had been making progress in her new therapy sessions with a doctor from the next county, someone outside Dan's sphere of influence. She was sleeping better and had started drawing pictures that didn't feature monsters or darkness. But if Dan was escalating his efforts, Emma's progress could be threatened. Craig's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Stevens," a familiar voice said when he answered. It was Dan. "I think we need to talk." Craig stepped into his home office and closed the door. "I have nothing to say to you." "Oh, I think you do. You see, I know you've been digging into my private life, making accusations, trying to turn people against me. That's harassment, Mr. Stevens. And harassment is illegal. So is child rape." Dan's laugh was cold. "Prove it." "Oh, wait, you can't. Because it didn't happen. But what has happened is that you've become obsessed with destroying an innocent man's reputation. That's defamation, Mr. Stevens. And I have very good lawyers." Craig kept his voice steady. "What do you want?" "I want you to stop. Stop investigating me. Stop spreading lies. Stop trying to poison people's minds against me. In return, I won't file criminal charges against you for harassment and stalking. And if I don't stop, then we'll see how much you really care about your family's safety." The line went dead. Craig stared at the phone, Dan's threat echoing in his mind. The man who'd raped his daughter was now threatening his family's physical safety, and Craig knew from his research that Dan had the resources and connections to make good on that threat. But instead of fear, Craig felt something else, a cold, calculating rage that settled into his bones like ice. Dan had just made his biggest mistake. He'd revealed his hand too early and given Craig the justification he needed to escalate his own plans. Craig opened his laptop and began typing a message to his team. "Game has changed. Target is now actively hostile. Moving to Phase 2 immediately. All constraints are off." Dan Woodard wanted to play hardball? Craig would show him what hardball really looked like. Chapter 5, The Trap Springs. The threatening phone call from Dan had accelerated Craig's timeline, but it also provided unexpected opportunities. If Dan was willing to make direct threats, he was getting desperate, and desperate people made mistakes. Craig's team moved into high gear. Emmanuel Christian deployed additional surveillance equipment around Dan's house and office, while Tyrone Clayton began following Dan's associates to establish their daily patterns. Alfred Moore focused on psychological warfare, developing strategies to increase paranoia within the network. But Craig's masterstroke came from an unexpected source, Dan himself. "He's planning something big," Emmanuel reported during an emergency meeting at the warehouse. "I intercepted communications about a gathering next weekend. All the major players will be there." Craig studied the intercepted messages on Emmanuel's laptop. Dan was organizing what appeared to be a social event at Judge Nelson's private estate, a party that would bring together every member of the network in one location. "It's perfect," Alfred realized. "They'll all be together, relaxed, off guard. If we're going to expose them, this is our chance." Craig was already forming a plan. "How's the security at Nelson's estate?" Tyrone consulted his reconnaissance files. "Minimal. He relies on isolation rather than protection. The property's 30 acres, gated, but not heavily monitored. Rich man's arrogance." "What about communications?" Emmanuel smiled. "I can control everything electronic within a 5-mile radius. Phone signals, internet, even their cars' GPS systems. They'll be completely cut off." The plan Craig outlined was audacious and dangerous. They would infiltrate the gathering, document everything happening there, and simultaneously feed information to law enforcement agencies outside the local network's influence. But Craig had a personal agenda that went beyond mere exposure. "I want Dan Woodard to know what it feels like to be helpless," he told his team. "I want him to experience the terror my daughter felt." The night of the party, Craig's team took their positions around Nelson's estate. Emmanuel's mobile command center was hidden in the woods, his equipment scanning all electronic communications. Tyrone had established observation posts at key points around the property. Alfred remained at the warehouse, coordinating with federal contacts who were standing by to act on whatever evidence they gathered. Craig himself would be going inside. Using Tyrone's surveillance data, Craig had identified a gap in the property's security. A service entrance used by catering staff provided access without triggering the main gate sensors. Craig had acquired a catering uniform and fake credentials that would let him move freely around the estate. The party was already in full swing when Craig arrived. The gathering appeared to be a typical social event for wealthy professionals. Expensive suits, champagne, classical music. But Craig's trained eye noticed the subtle signs that marked it as something far more sinister. There were no women present except for servers, and those servers were all young, vulnerable-looking girls who kept their eyes downcast and moved with the careful precision of people who'd been thoroughly intimidated. Craig recognized several faces from his investigation files. Judge Nelson held court near the bar, regaling listeners with stories that made them laugh too loudly. District Attorney Chung was deep in conversation with a man Craig identified as Mayor Bob Hurst, another network member they hadn't known about. And there was Dan Woodard, looking completely at ease as he chatted with men who shared his twisted appetites. Craig activated the recording equipment hidden in his catering jacket and began moving through the room, documenting faces and conversations. The casual way these men discussed their crimes was sickening. Children referred to as merchandise, families described as obstacles to be managed. But the real horror began when the party moved to Nelson's private screening room. Craig positioned himself outside the room's service entrance, his recording equipment capturing everything as the network members settled in to watch videos of their crimes. Dan's voice was clearly audible as he narrated his assault on Emma, describing her fear and pain with enthusiastic detail. Craig's hands shook with rage as he listened to these monsters discussing his daughter like she was an object for their entertainment. But he forced himself to remain calm, to gather evidence, to build the case that would destroy them all. Then something went wrong. A hand clamped down on Craig's shoulder, and he found himself face to face with Andrew Poole, a massive man he recognized from Tyrone's surveillance photos as Nelson's head of security. Lost are we? Poole's voice was deadly quiet. Craig's cover story died in his throat as Poole's grip tightened on his shoulder. The man was armed, professionally trained, and suspicious of Craig's presence in an area meant only for trusted staff. Mr. Stevens, Dan Woodard's voice came from behind him. Craig turned to see Dan standing in the screening room doorway, his trademark smile replaced by something cold and predatory. How wonderful that you could join us, though I don't recall sending you an invitation. The other network members emerged from the screening room, surrounding Craig with the casual confidence of men accustomed to being untouchable. You've been a very busy man, Judge Nelson said, his judicial robes replaced by expensive casual wear, but his authority intact. Harassment, stalking, illegal surveillance. Quite a list of charges we could file. District Attorney Chung nodded. Unfortunately, Mr. Stevens, you've trespassed on private property while conducting illegal surveillance. That makes you a criminal. Craig remained silent, his mind working through options. His team was in position. His equipment was still recording, and Emmanuel would be monitoring all communications. But he was outnumbered and outgunned, surrounded by men who'd proven they were capable of anything. The question, Dan continued, is what we do with you now. You've seen things you shouldn't have seen, heard things that could cause misunderstandings. Like the truth about what you did to my daughter. Dan's smile returned. Your daughter enjoyed our time together. She's very mature for her age. Very responsive. Craig's control finally snapped. He lunged at Dan, but Poole was ready. A single blow to Craig's kidneys dropped him to his knees, gasping in pain. Now, Nelson chided. Violence solves nothing. We're civilized men here. As Craig struggled to breathe, he heard Dan's voice close to his ear. You should have taken my advice and stopped investigating me. Now your whole family is going to pay the price for your obsession. The network members discussed Craig's fate with the detached professionalism of men planning a business meeting. They would eliminate him, of course, but they needed to be careful about the timing and method. What they didn't know was that every word was being recorded and transmitted to Emmanuel's command center, where it was being simultaneously forwarded to Joseph Burton's federal task force. Craig's apparent capture wasn't a failure of his plan. It was the final piece. Chapter 6, The Reckoning begins. As Dan's network debated Craig's fate, they remained unaware that Emmanuel Christian was monitoring their every word from his mobile command center. The surveillance equipment Craig carried wasn't just recording, it was transmitting everything in real time to multiple law enforcement agencies across 3 states. But Craig had planned for more than just evidence gathering. His apparent capture was designed to make the network feel secure, to encourage them to reveal information they'd normally keep hidden. "The federal task force knows about you," Craig told them, his voice strained from Poole's assault, but his words carefully chosen. "They've been watching your network for months." Judge Nelson's expression shifted from confidence to concern. "You're bluffing." Agent Joseph Burton, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Task Force designation, Fallen Angels. Ring any bells? The reaction was immediate and telling. Several network members exchanged worried glances, and Craig knew his intelligence had hit its mark. "You're lying," Dan said, but his voice lacked conviction. Craig pressed his advantage. "Burton's been tracking your encrypted communications for 6 months. He knows about the safe houses, the financial transfers, the victim testimonies you've been suppressing." What Craig didn't mention was that Burton's investigation had been stalled by jurisdictional issues and lack of direct evidence. But the network members didn't know that, and their growing paranoia was exactly what Craig needed. District Attorney Chung was already reaching for his phone. "We need to contact our sources, find out what the feds really know." No phones. Emmanuel's voice crackled through concealed speakers Craig had helped install earlier. The network members spun around, searching for the source of the sound. "Gentlemen," Emmanuel continued, his voice echoing through Nelson's estate, "you're surrounded. All communications have been jammed. All escape routes are blocked. And everything you've said in the past hour has been recorded and transmitted to federal authorities." The panic was immediate and beautiful. Judge Nelson rushed to his landline phone, only to find it dead. Mayor Hurst tried his cell phone with the same result. Dan Woodard looked like he was about to vomit. "This is impossible," Nelson stammered. "My security systems have been compromised for weeks," Craig said, climbing slowly to his feet. Andrew Poole's grip on his shoulder had loosened as the security chief tried to process what was happening. The sound of helicopters approaching from multiple directions filled the air, followed by the unmistakable rumble of heavily armed vehicles moving up the estate's long driveway. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." A voice boomed through external speakers. "The property is surrounded. Exit the building with your hands visible." Craig smiled as he watched 20 years of careful criminal enterprise collapse in real time. But his personal satisfaction was just beginning. "There's something else you should know," he told Dan, who was staring out the window at the approaching FBI tactical teams. "All those videos you've been collecting, the ones documenting your crimes, they've been uploaded to servers around the world. By tomorrow morning, every law enforcement agency, every news organization, and every advocacy group will have copies." Dan's face went white. "That's impossible. My security was compromised the day you threatened my family," Craig finished. "Emmanuel's been inside your systems for weeks. Every file, every communication, every financial transaction, all of it documented, all of it preserved, all of it admissible in court." The front door exploded inward as FBI tactical teams entered the estate. Agent Burton's voice echoed through the house. "Everyone on the ground. Hands visible. This is a federal operation." But Craig wasn't finished with his revenge. As the network members were forced to the ground and zip-tied, Craig approached Dan with deliberate slowness. "You asked my daughter if she was scared," Craig said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Now I'm asking you the same question." Dan was trembling, his perfect composure shattered by the reality of his situation. The man who'd terrorized children was reduced to a quivering mess by the prospect of facing consequences for his actions. "Please," Dan whispered, "we can make a deal. I have information, connections. I can help you." Craig knelt down, so he was at eye level with Dan. My 8-year-old daughter showed more courage than you're showing right now. She called for help when she was scared. Who are you going to call? Agent Burton approached Craig with a mixture of professional respect and personal satisfaction. Mr. Stevens, I need you to come with us for debriefing. But I wanted you to know what we've gathered tonight will put all of these men away for life. As federal agents led the network members out in handcuffs, Craig felt a satisfaction deeper than anything his law enforcement career had ever provided. But this was only the beginning of Dan Woodard's punishment. The public exposure would be devastating, careers destroyed, families shattered, reputations obliterated. The legal proceedings would be lengthy and humiliating, with every detail of their crimes exposed in open court. But Craig had planned for more than just justice. He'd planned for complete destruction. Over the next several days, as news of the network's arrest dominated headlines, Craig's additional preparations came to fruition. Property records he manipulated ensured that civil asset forfeiture would seize everything the network members owned. Social media accounts he'd hacked began posting their criminal confessions to friends and family members. Financial records he'd obtained showed a pattern of money laundering that would trigger additional federal investigations. Dan Woodard, who'd thought himself untouchable just a week earlier, found himself facing hundreds of federal charges, civil lawsuits from dozens of victims' families, and complete social ostracism. But Craig's masterpiece was yet to come. Chapter 7: Personal Justice. The federal arrests were just the beginning of Craig's comprehensive revenge against Dan Woodard and his network. While the FBI processed the evidence and built their cases, Craig implemented the more personal aspects of his plan. 3 days after the raid on Nelson's estate, Dan was released on bond, a decision that surprised everyone except Craig, who'd been counting on it. Dan's high-powered attorneys had argued successfully that he wasn't a flight risk, given his community ties and cooperation with authorities. What they didn't know was that Craig had orchestrated Dan's release through carefully placed pressure on the federal magistrate. He wanted Dan free, because what he had planned required Dan to be in the world, experiencing every moment of his destruction. Craig had spent months studying Dan's psychology, learning his fears and weaknesses. Dan's greatest vulnerability wasn't physical. It was his desperate need to maintain control and his terror of public humiliation. Craig began with Dan's professional reputation. Using Emmanuel's hacking skills, he ensured that Dan's arrest record and criminal allegations appeared on every background check system in the country. Job applications were automatically flagged, housing applications were denied, and credit applications were rejected. Within a week, Dan lost his consulting contracts, his professional licenses, and his business relationships. The carefully constructed identity that had taken him years to build crumbled overnight. But Craig was just getting started. Tyrone Clayton's investigation had revealed that Dan maintained financial accounts under multiple identities. Using forged documents and Emmanuel's digital manipulation, Craig systematically emptied these accounts, transferring the money to victims' advocacy groups and child protection organizations. Dan's assets vanished like smoke, leaving him unable to pay for his defense attorneys, his mortgage, or even basic living expenses. The social destruction was even more thorough. Craig had identified everyone in Dan's life: co-workers, neighbors, casual acquaintances, even his barista at the local coffee shop. Each received anonymous packages containing documentation of Dan's crimes, complete with photos and video evidence. Dan's church expelled him. His gym revoked his membership. His neighbors organized petition drives to force him to move. Everywhere he went, he encountered people who knew exactly what he'd done. The psychological pressure was relentless and calculated. Craig had studied military interrogation techniques and psychological warfare tactics, adapting them for his purposes. He wanted Dan to experience the same helplessness and terror that Emma had felt. Emmanuel established digital surveillance that monitored Dan's every electronic communication. When Dan tried to reach out to former associates for help, Craig ensured those communications were intercepted and the recipients received additional evidence of Dan's guilt. When Dan attempted to find new housing, landlords received anonymous tips about his criminal history. When he applied for jobs, employers received detailed packets about his arrests. Dan was trapped in a shrinking circle of isolation and despair, exactly as Craig had intended. But the most personal element of Craig's revenge was still to come. Using Tyrone's skills, Craig had tracked down Dan's estranged father, a man named William Slaughter who'd abandoned Dan and his mother when Dan was 12 years old. William was now a retired minister living in a small town in Montana, completely unaware of his son's crimes. Craig arranged for William to receive a comprehensive package documenting Dan's activities, along with a letter from Emma describing what Dan had done to her. The package included a phone number where William could reach Craig if he wanted to discuss his son's actions. The call came 3 days later. "Mr. Stevens," William's voice was heavy with grief and shame. "I got your package. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything, Reverend Slaughter. I just thought you should know what your son became. I abandoned him when he was a boy. Maybe if I'd stayed, if I'd been a better father." Craig felt no sympathy for the old man. "Your son made his choices as an adult. He chose to hurt children. He chose to hurt my daughter. What can I do? How can I make this right?" Craig had been hoping for this question. Write him a letter. Tell him you know what he's done. Tell him you're ashamed of him. Tell him he's no longer your son. The psychological impact on Dan was devastating. The letter from his father arrived the same day Dan was evicted from his apartment for non-payment of rent. Emmanuel's surveillance captured Dan's breakdown as he read his father's words of rejection and condemnation. Craig watched the surveillance footage with cold satisfaction. Dan Woodard, who'd terrorized children with impunity, was finally experiencing consequences for his actions. But Craig's revenge wasn't finished. He'd saved the most personal element for last, a direct confrontation that would give Dan one final chance to understand exactly why his life was being destroyed. Craig arranged to meet Dan at a diner on the outskirts of town, far from any witnesses or surveillance. Dan arrived looking haggard and desperate, the polished confidence he'd once projected completely gone. "You did this," Dan said without preamble. "The arrests, the financial problems, the social ostracism. This is all you." Craig didn't deny it. "Every bit of it." "Why?" "The legal system is handling this. I'm going to prison. Isn't that enough?" Craig studied Dan's face, seeing fear and confusion where once there'd been arrogance and cruelty. "You hurt my daughter," Craig said simply. "You violated her, traumatized her, and then you threatened my family when I tried to seek justice. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences?" "I'm sorry," Dan said, though Craig could tell the words were calculated rather than sincere. "I know I made mistakes, but destroying my entire life won't undo what happened." "You're right," Craig agreed. "It won't undo Emma's trauma, but it will ensure you never hurt another child. And it will show Emma that her father fought for her when the system failed." Craig leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You asked Emma if she was scared when you were abusing her. For the rest of your life, every time you feel afraid, every time you feel helpless, every time you wonder if things could get worse, remember that feeling. That's what you did to my little girl." Dan's face crumpled, and for a moment Craig saw him as he really was, not a master manipulator or protected predator, but a broken man facing the consequences of his actions. Craig stood to leave, but Dan grabbed his arm. "Please, I'll do anything. I'll confess to everything, cooperate completely. Just make it stop." Craig looked down at Dan's desperate face and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "It's too late for deals. You had your chance to face justice with dignity. Now you'll face it on my terms." As Craig walked away, he knew Dan's punishment would continue long after the legal proceedings ended. The network of protection was gone, the financial resources exhausted, the social isolation complete. Dan Woodard would spend the rest of his life knowing that every loss, every humiliation, every moment of fear was payment for what he'd done to Emma Stevens. And Craig was far from finished with him. Chapter 8, The Final Trap. 6 months after the raid on Judge Nelson's estate, the federal trials were proceeding exactly as Craig had orchestrated. The network members were turning on each other with predictable desperation, each trying to negotiate better deals by providing evidence against their former associates. Judge Patrick Nelson received a 25-year sentence after his gambling debts and corruption were exposed. District Attorney Ernest Chung faced similar charges and was looking at life in prison. Mayor Bob Hurst had already pled guilty to multiple counts of conspiracy and child exploitation. But Dan Woodard remained defiant. Despite overwhelming evidence, despite the testimony of multiple victims, despite video documentation of his crimes, Dan had rejected every plea offer and insisted on going to trial. His new court-appointed attorney, his high-powered legal team having abandoned him when his funds dried up, was preparing a defense based on entrapment and prosecutorial misconduct. Craig knew exactly why Dan was fighting so hard. He still believed he could win, still thought his superior intelligence and manipulative skills could overcome the evidence against him. Craig was about to disabuse him of that notion permanently. The key to Craig's final trap had been planted months earlier, during the chaos following the arrests. Emmanuel Christian had discovered that Dan maintained a secret storage unit under a false identity, containing backup drives with evidence of crimes dating back 15 years. Instead of turning this information over to the FBI immediately, Craig had chosen to wait. He wanted Dan to feel secure in the knowledge that this evidence remained hidden, to build his defense around the assumption that the prosecutors only had what they'd seized during the raid. Dan's court-appointed attorney, Willard Carey, was competent but overwhelmed. He'd built his defense strategy around challenging the admissibility of the surveillance evidence and claiming that Dan had been entrapped by Craig's investigation. What Carey didn't know was that Craig had been feeding him information through carefully orchestrated leaks, guiding his defense strategy in exactly the direction Craig wanted it to go. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in February. Craig sat in the gallery with Christina and Emma, watching as Dan entered the courtroom in an ill-fitting suit, his face gaunt from months of stress and social isolation. Emma had requested to attend the trial, despite her therapist's concerns. At 9 years old, she'd shown remarkable resilience, and she wanted to see the man who'd hurt her face justice. "That's him, isn't it, Daddy?" she whispered as Dan took his place at the defense table. "That's him, sweetheart. But he can't hurt you anymore." The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. FBI agent Joseph Burton testified about the network's operations and the evidence gathered during their investigation. Dr. Agnes Koch provided expert testimony about Emma's trauma and recovery. But the defense's strategy became clear during opening statements. Carey was arguing that Dan had been manipulated and entrapped by Craig's investigation, that the evidence had been obtained illegally, and that his client was the victim of a vindictive father's obsession. It was exactly what Craig had expected. On the third day of testimony, Carey called his first character witness, William Slaughter, Dan's estranged father. Craig had anticipated this move and had prepared accordingly. William took the stand reluctantly, his aged hands shaking as he was sworn in. Under Carey's questioning, he testified about abandoning Dan as a child, expressing regret for his failures as a father and suggesting that those failures had contributed to Dan's psychological problems. But on cross-examination, the prosecution revealed William's recent letter to Dan, the one Craig had orchestrated, in which the old minister had disowned his son completely. "You wrote to your son that you were ashamed to share his name," the prosecutor read, "that his actions were an abomination before God and man. Do you remember writing those words?" William's face crumpled. "I was angry, upset. I didn't mean." "So you were lying then, or you're lying now?" The contradiction destroyed William's credibility and damaged Dan's defense. But Craig's masterpiece was still to come. On the fifth day of trial, as Carey prepared to rest his defense, Craig activated the final phase of his plan. Anonymous tips led police to Dan's secret storage unit. Inside, they found terabytes of video evidence documenting hundreds of crimes against dozens of children. The evidence was so extensive and damning that even Carey couldn't argue against its authenticity. But the timing of the discovery wasn't coincidental. Craig had arranged for it to be found during the trial, when Dan's defense was already committed to their strategy, too late to change course. The impact on Dan was visible to everyone in the courtroom. As the prosecutor introduced exhibit after exhibit from the storage unit, Dan's composure finally cracked completely. "This is impossible," he whispered to his attorney, loud enough for the jury to hear. That storage unit was secure. No one knew about it. Carrie tried to salvage the situation by requesting a recess, but the damage was done. The jury had heard Dan essentially confess to maintaining a secret cache of child pornography. But Craig had saved the most devastating evidence for last. Among the files in the storage unit was a detailed journal Dan had kept, documenting his crimes and his thoughts about his victims. The entries about Emma were particularly graphic and disturbing, describing her fear and pain in clinical detail while expressing Dan's satisfaction at her suffering. As the prosecutor read excerpts from the journal aloud, Emma squeezed Craig's hand tightly but didn't look away. She wanted to hear everything, to understand completely what had been done to her and why. Dan's reaction to his own words being read in court was everything Craig had hoped for. The man who'd terrorized children with calculated cruelty was reduced to sobbing wreck, begging the judge to make it stop. But there was no mercy for Dan Woodard, just as there had been no mercy for his victims. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Dan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, to be served in a maximum security facility where his crimes would be well known to the other inmates. As the bailiff led Dan away in shackles, he looked back at Craig with a mixture of hatred and broken despair. Craig met his gaze steadily, allowing Dan to see the cold satisfaction in his eyes. Dan had learned too late that there were consequences for harming Craig Stevens' family, consequences that went far beyond anything the legal system could provide. But even as Dan began his life sentence, Craig's revenge was still not complete. Chapter 9. Justice Served. 2 years after Dan Woodard's conviction, Craig Stevens stood in his backyard watching Emma play with their new puppy. At 11 years old, she was thriving, excelling in school, making friends, and showing no signs of the trauma that had once defined her life. The physical scars had healed. The psychological ones were managed through continued therapy and the unwavering love of her family. But most importantly, Emma had seen justice serve in a way that proved to her that she mattered, that her pain mattered, and that people who hurt children would face consequences. Craig's phone buzzed with a message from Warren Young. Thought you want to know, Dan Woodard was found dead in his cell this morning. Apparent suicide. Craig read the message twice, then deleted it. He felt no grief for Dan's death, but no particular satisfaction either. Dan's punishment had been complete long before he'd taken his own life. The network that had protected Dan was completely destroyed. Judge Nelson had died of a heart attack 6 months into his sentence. District Attorney Chung had been murdered by another inmate who'd lost his own child to abuse. Mayor Hurst was serving his sentence in protective custody, a broken man who'd lost everything he'd ever valued. But Craig's most successful revenge had been against the system that had failed his family. Using the evidence gathered from Dan's network, Joseph Burton's federal task force had exposed corruption in dozens of jurisdictions across multiple states. Judges were removed, prosecutors were indicted, and law enforcement agencies were reformed. The case had become a model for how to investigate and prosecute organized child exploitation networks. Craig had been invited to consult with law enforcement agencies around the world, sharing the techniques he'd developed to expose and destroy predator networks. He'd turned his rage into a mission, his need for personal revenge into a systematic campaign for justice. Christina joined him on the deck, slipping her arm around his waist as they watched Emma play. "Any regrets?" she asked quietly. Craig considered the question seriously. He'd broken numerous laws, destroyed multiple lives, and abandoned every principle he'd once held about justice and due process. "No," he said finally. "None at all. The legal system had failed Emma when she needed it most. The authorities had been corrupted, the networks of protection had been too strong, and the predators had felt themselves untouchable. Craig had proven them wrong in the most permanent way possible." Emma ran up to them, the puppy trailing behind her. "Daddy, can we go to the park?" "Of course, sweetheart," Craig said, lifting his daughter in his arms. "Anything you want." As they prepared to leave, Craig reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The scared, traumatized little girl who'd called him that night 2 years ago had grown into a confident, happy child who understood that her father would always protect her. The man who'd hurt her was gone. The network that had protected him was destroyed. The system that had failed her had been reformed. Justice had been served, not the sanitized, procedural justice of courtrooms and plea bargains, but the raw, personal justice of a father protecting his child. Craig had learned that sometimes the law wasn't enough. Sometimes justice required a willingness to step outside the system, to fight on terms the predators didn't expect, to use their own weapons against them. He'd sacrificed his faith in institutions, his respect for legal procedures, and his belief in the inherent goodness of authority figures. In return, he'd gained something more valuable, the absolute certainty that he would do anything to protect his family. As they drove to the park, Emma chattering happily in the back seat about her plans for the day, Craig made a silent promise. He would continue his work exposing predator networks, continue his mission to protect children who had no one else to fight for them. Because he'd learned the most important lesson of his life. When the system fails, sometimes good people have to become dangerous people. And Craig Stevens was very, very dangerous to anyone who threatened children. The father's reckoning was complete, but his mission had just begun. Years later, when other parents found themselves betrayed by systems that promised protection but delivered only bureaucracy and failure, they would hear whispered stories about a man who'd made predators afraid, who'd turned the hunters into the hunted. They would hear about Craig Stevens, and they would know that justice, real justice, was possible, even if it came at a price that few were willing to pay. Craig had paid that price gladly, and he would pay it again without hesitation. Because some things, like a father's love for his daughter, were worth any sacrifice. And some people, like those who hurt innocent children, deserved every consequence they received. The father's reckoning was over. Justice had been served. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.